Just a few short years ago, the subject of today's video was considered a top 10 draft pick. He was seen as a future franchise quarterback in the NFL, a superstar quarterback for USC, and had one of the best freshman campaigns we've seen in the last decade or so. Except, after one good year, Kedon Slovis really fell off. He struggled in both 2020 and 2021 for the Trojans, really struggled at Pittsburgh in 2022, and then this past year at BYU, wasn't necessarily able to save his career. He went from a guy who was supposed to be a top 10 pick to now being undrafted with the Indianapolis Colts. In today's video, I want to revisit Kedon Slovis. We're going to talk about his crazy recruiting story, how he had a historic season at USC in 2019, what happened to him afterwards, and why he ended up going undrafted. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I could cover next. Now let's get started and talk about what happened to Kedon Slovis. In order to understand how Slovis got to this point, we first need to go back in time. Kedon Slovis would grow up in the Midwest, and he always loved sports and was a gifted athlete. After moving to the state of Arizona, he was marching towards his eventual goal of being a college athlete. He walked into Desert Mountain High School with pretty big shoes to fill, as just a few years earlier, former 5-star and NFL quarterback Kyle Allen walked the same exact halls that Kedon now did. He was not just a good football player though, he was also elite at basketball, and although Slovis showed a lot of promise in basketball his freshman year, football was going to be his future. He was even the basketball team MVP, but the analytical nature of the quarterback position brought him back to football, and he fell in love with it. His father said, quote, "He just loved the position of quarterback. He loved where he gets to dissect what the other team's doing, and then analyze and make a decision what his team's going to do with the play." After that, Kedon slowly began to focus on football, putting in a ton of extra hours, and started working with a quarterback coach in addition to high school football practices. His father recalls a conversation he had with his son about his goals as an athlete. Even before Slovis was a varsity starter, he was confident he wanted to be a Division I quarterback. His dad said, quote, "We sat down and talked about it a bit, and I said, all right then, that is your job, and your job is to become a Division I quarterback. You need to get a job after hours, and this now becomes your biggest goal, and you can make it happen." Unlike many future Division I quarterbacks though, Slovis did not start for his team as a sophomore. He waited behind a then senior, and as a backup, he initially struggled with the wordiness and complexity of the play sheet. Except, once he became a starter his junior season, coaches and scouts not only noticed his work ethic, but his ability to take accountability and recover from mistakes. This was a critical trait for a quarterback, and he also had some help from a legend. At the time, Desert Mountain High School had just hired Kurt Warner to be their offensive coordinator. This was obviously a huge deal, and he quickly turned around the offense. Slovis started to feast, as during his first 2 games of his junior year, he passed for 674 yards and 8 touchdowns without an interception. He credited Warner for it. He said, quote, "I definitely have to credit Coach Warner with the majority of my football knowledge. It's amazing to have the opportunity to learn from an NFL mind, and when he breaks the defense down, it makes everything so much easier." During his 2 years as a starter for Desert Mountain, he was expected to compensate for a small offensive line and a defense that was atrocious. His coach said, quote, "I told him early on, we're going to expect you to do more than most high school quarterbacks, from calling plays to what you're going to have to see, and more importantly, the amount of throws you're going to have to make each game. It's probably going to be more than any quarterback in the league," and apparently he welcomed every opportunity to make every play. He'd end up skyrocketing, as a junior, he passed for nearly 3,000 yards with 32 touchdowns. After this, everything would change, as he went from an unknown player to a pretty big name. Kurt Warner said, quote, "Once the coaches came in, it was like, okay, what does this kid have? Why have we not heard of him?" And it was simply because nobody actually took a look at who he was and what he was capable of. In 2018, Slovis became the fastest rising quarterback in the country, picking up his first offer on March 29th, and then a couple weeks later, a dozen more would follow. He eventually got one from USC, and this would start to change the game. He said, quote, "I talked to Coach Helton on the phone after practice, and he offered me. USC is definitely a school I'm very interested in, and I plan to take a visit soon." He got his first SEC offer from Vanderbilt, and soon after that, Oregon State also offered, but eventually the lure of the USC Trojans won out. His coach said, quote, "USC has been one of his favorite teams growing up, and their offense fits his strengths really well." As I said, USC was a team that put it over the edge, and he committed to them just 5 days after getting the offer. Slovis said it was at the top of his list, and that he wanted to take a few days, talk to his family and coaches, and make sure it was the right fit for him. He also loved the academics and the storied success of the football program. Slovis became a buzzing name with big stats, as he finished with more than 5,500 yards and 50 touchdowns in just 2 years as a starter. While being a USC commit carries some weight, he ultimately was not that big of a deal in the rankings, as according to 24/7 Sports, he was a 3-star recruit, the number 19 quarterback, and the 258th best player in the class of 2019. So, how would Slovis do at USC? When Slovis arrived at USC, coaches raved about how good he was in practice, and pretty soon he became one of the best stories in all of college football. Except it almost didn't happen. Slovis was consistently reminded of the fact that he was between two 5-star quarterbacks. They had just brought in JT Daniels in 2018, and Bryce Young was committed for 2020. Everyone said he would never get a chance to play, but he said, quote, "Everyone brings it up, and it's the same answer. Let's go see what happens. People are always like, why do you go there? There's all these great quarterbacks, blah blah blah. Let's go see what happens," is what he said. Well, yeah, let's see what happens. In week 1, JT Daniels tore his ACL midway through the game, and everything changed. He said, quote, "It was terrible to see JT go down, as he's my teammate and my friend, and I didn't know he was going to be out for the entire year. But everyone gets their opportunity at some point, and you never know when you're going to get another one." That is what would happen for Kedon Slovis. He would absolutely shatter expectations, as he threw for 3,502 yards, 30 touchdowns, and became the Pac-12 Freshman of the Year. In particular, his best game of the season would come against UCLA, as he set a single-game school record with 515 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. He also helped them win 52-35 and became the first player in USC history to throw for more than 400 yards in 3 consecutive games. USC ended up going 8-5, and Kedon Slovis was truly the future of the program, and everyone was raving about him. He was even so dang good that JT Daniels transferred to Georgia, and just like that, the 3-star recruit from Desert Mountain was now one of the biggest names in the country and at the top of NFL draft boards. Early mock drafts in 2022 had him as a top 10 pick, and it looked like the sky was going to be the limit for him. In a weird 2020 season, Slovis would end up appearing in 6 total games. He was actually really solid, as in particular against both Washington State and UCLA, he had 5 touchdowns in each game. He ended up leading them to the Pac-12 championship where they lost to Oregon, and on the season he threw for 1,900 yards with 17 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. This came in 6 games, and his NFL draft stock was in great shape. He was considered a dark horse Heisman candidate and a first-round draft pick for 2022. He'd just have to have one more good season. Sadly, 2021 was sort of a disaster. Pretty early on, he started to struggle, as he really played down to competition and blew a game to Stanford in week 2, and then after that would start to struggle with injuries. His best game of the year came against Colorado, as he threw for 276 yards and 3 touchdowns, but other than a 400-yard game against Utah, he was pretty forgettable. He ended up struggling with injuries throughout the entirety of the year. In Jackson Dart, we had a couple of opportunities to play. Head coach Clay Helton was also fired, and everything fell apart for Slovis really quickly. He lost all of his draft stock, and also decided to enter the transfer portal after the season was over. Apparently he had a couple of decent options, but it ended up coming down between Pitt and Notre Dame. I guess that was for multiple reasons, but some say it was the perfect fresh start, and he also saw what Kenny Pickett just did. One Pittsburgh beat writer said, quote, "I think going to an offense like Pitt, where we saw what Kenny did last year, you're not just playing catch. You're going to be able to read, identify, and do all the things he wants to do to show that he can play at the next level. This definitely seemed to be an NFL move, as he's hoping to do 1 year there and then leave." It was true, he would do 1 year at Pittsburgh, but it didn't go as planned. While he did have 300 yards and a touchdown in their Week 1 win over West Virginia, after that he really didn't do a whole lot. He ended up getting hurt and lost that game to number 24 Tennessee, and then from there, just wasn't great. He did have 3 touchdowns and a loss to Georgia Tech, but against Rhode Island, Virginia Tech, Louisville, North Carolina, and Syracuse combined, he did not have a single touchdown. He had plenty of interceptions in that same time period though, and it was just really rough. He did throw touchdowns and wins over Virginia and Duke before he would end the year with 3 touchdowns and a win over Miami. While Slovis did finish the year, I guess, somewhat strong, it was an extremely disappointing season. He threw for 2,300 yards with 10 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, and Pittsburgh did not go according to plan. From there, Slovis would decide to enter the transfer portal for the second time and would find his final school, BYU. They had just lost Jaron Hall to the NFL draft, so Slovis was expected to step in right away and fill that void. The Cougars were also headed to the Big 12, and things did get a little bit better for Slovis. He had 2 touchdowns in their first game against Sam Houston State, and then had a career-high 5 total touchdowns and a win over Southern Utah. Except those are pretty bad teams. After that, he threw 6 touchdowns combined in games over Arkansas, Kansas, and Cincinnati before he would start to stagnate again. He didn't have a touchdown in a blowout loss to TCU, helped them beat Texas Tech, and then had 2 interceptions in a blowout loss to Texas. From there, he was done for the year after his injuries, as he apparently had strained something in his elbow and it was time to call it quits. In total, he threw for 1,700 yards with 15 total touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and it was a disappointing year for Slovis. Somehow, someway though, he's still getting a chance to be in the NFL. He ended up getting invited to the NFL Scouting Combine and was a somewhat trendy name to go in the back half of the draft. Honestly, outside of the top 6 this year's draft class, seemed pretty weak at the quarterback spot, as after Spencer Rattler and Michael Pratt, Slovis could have been penciled in as that 9th or 10th best quarterback. He definitely had potential, but his last 3 years were not great. As we all expected though, he did not end up getting drafted and has now been picked up by the Indianapolis Colts. Some think he has a shot to make the roster, but honestly I really don't know. He has not been good for the past 3 years now, and his throwing elbow, that's probably not going to help anything out. So what ended up going wrong for Slovis? After reading through everything, I don't have a great answer for it. Honestly, I think it was 2 things. I think those injuries didn't help, and then I think mostly he lost his confidence. That 2021 USC season was not great, and I think that put some doubt in his brain. Potentially all that hype may have gotten to his head as well, and after that, once you become a bust, it's hard to change people's perception. He couldn't get it done at Pittsburgh, and he couldn't get it done at BYU, and also in retrospect, I don't think those 2 schools were great fits, and honestly it's just sad. At one point, Slovis was supposed to be a franchise quarterback and a top 10 pick, but sadly, he had a fall from grace, and it just didn't happen. But what do you guys think? If you're a USC, BYU, or a Pitt fan, what do you think of Kedon Slovis? What do you think went wrong for him? And what player should I do a draft stock collapse video on next? Be sure to let me know down below. Leave a like if you support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.